Good evening. I'm Rhonda Goldfein. I'm the chair of the Police Advisory Commission. To my left is Chuck Bowles, one of the commissioners. We're usually flanked by more commissioners. It's been a hot week. It's the summer, but we certainly appreciate the community coming out to join us. The staff is here. Will you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Kelvin Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of the Police Advisory Commission.
And
Edwin Pace, Special Investigator, Police Advisory Commission.
And Sheila's around here somewhere.
She's making copies.
Okay.
She's our executive assistant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Some of you may not know the briefest of history of the Police Advisory Commission, so just to give a sense of who we are and what we hope to do. The Police Advisory Commission was created in 1993 by an executive order of then Mayor Rendell, and the charge was really to look to the relations between the police and the community. And over those years, with our able staff, we've looked at, how can we improve those relations? How can we create an atmosphere of trust and cooperation between the community and the police? We meet monthly to hear what the community has to say. We go out into neighborhoods. The organization has held hearings on various issues, and we're planning to do some more of that in the fall and I guess the winter and into 2017, and Kelvin will tell us more about that. Usually the format is that we talk about commission business, and then we have an open session to hear what our guests are thinking. Since it's a small number of us, we're going to be very quick on the commission business. Kelvin will give his full report, and then we're really interested in hearing anything that may be on your mind. So, Chuck?
Well, we will defer. We have minutes to approve from June 20th and July 18th. We require a quorum, which is 50% plus one. We don't have that. So we will review these minutes via the internet and vote to approve them. There's currently 8 commissioners, so quorum is 5 of us. There's been at least 2 deaths and 2 vacations, so that accounts.
Joined by Mr. Riddick.
Yes. And traditionally, we meet on the 3rd Monday of the month. So our next meetings are September 19th, October 17th, November 21st. So come back and join us again in the future, and maybe we'll be lucky enough to come out and join you in the neighborhood. This is always fun when we do that.
And when the commissioner is fully staffed, we should have 19 commissioners.
That's correct.
So there has been some attrition, and there is some movement we're anticipating that Kelvin will talk about.
Sure. Well, just to, I guess, to start off on that note, one of the things that's happening right now in the city is there's a consideration by the Kenney administration to strengthen or change police oversight in the city. One of the things that's on the table right now is looking at the powers and duties that this organization has, also in connection with the other police oversight board that Mayor Nutter created after the Justice Department came in and looked at shootings in the department 2 years ago. That board is set up, which I'm also a member, was set up to deal specifically with the recommendations of that report. And as a result of some overlapping functions between the 2 entities, what's occurring now is discussion at the mayoral level of what we should do to combine the tasks of the 2 executive orders. There's an executive order that governs this body. There's an executive order that Mayor Nutter passed last year that governs that body. They're very similar. So what you're going to see occur over the fall and into the early winter is discussions about how to put those 2 entities together and hopefully end up with something that's better resourced and that answers a lot of the questions that you have a lot better. The other thing I wanted to talk about too is obviously on my report here, you'll see my first paragraph. I always lead off with the basic review of how many complaints and audits the commission itself is dealing with, and also contrast that to the number of citizens' complaints that are in play around the entire city. So you'll see that I mentioned we have 21 complaints against police in 2016. Those are 20 complaints that were filed directly through our office. The larger scope there is the 385 complaints that are filed with the department as a whole. Those are complaints that are filed through internal affairs, through police districts, etc. So in the work that we do, in addition to obviously looking at the complaints that come through our door, we have access to all of the complaints that come into the district. We review those complaints for several things. We review the investigations themselves to see if they were thorough, did they ask the right questions. And we also review them for systemic issues like, are we getting more complaints about certain officers? Are we getting more complaints of a certain type? So that's what you see me trying to sort of lay the groundwork for in that first paragraph. We're also working on our annual report, which we will present at the September meeting, which will give you a lot more details on all those complaints, all of the investigations that we've been involved in over the last year and a half or so. The third item on my report this evening is the Shallot case. This is a case we've been discussing for several months. Actually, I'm not surprised Ms. Shallot isn't here tonight. We did today actually receive a formal response from Internal Affairs. We had sent Internal Affairs a series of questions about that particular case, which they have now answered for us. I'm going to present those to the board via email over the next several days, and we'll figure out where we want to go on that particular complaint from there. Another major issue that we're looking at right now is obviously pedestrian and vehicle stop data. We've been working with the police department's research section to look at all of the vehicle and pedestrian stops, not only at the city level, but at a district level. So when I go out to your neighborhoods, I'll be able to tell you exactly what pedestrian and vehicle stops were made in your neighborhood, why they were made, and we'll also, once we get the full data set, and that's another thing we're working on with the city, we'll also know who the officers who made the stops are, and we'll be able to then go back and compare that information to what types of complaints people have filed around those issues, etc. Okay. The last couple of weeks, the last week of December, or of July, of course, we had the Democratic National Convention in town. All four of us covered that, and we were out watching to make sure that the police were doing their job properly. I'm pleased to report that what we saw was encouraging. The police department, we thought, did a very good job in dealing with the issues around the Democratic National Convention. I've excerpted some of my notes from day 3 when there was a particularly contentious moment where you see some of the photos that I took below there, myself and staff. That was right at the fence, right by the Wells Fargo Center. There was a point Wednesday night where that fence was breached, and that's where you see those 6 photos there. There was some confusion that happened. Order was rather quickly restored, in large part in result to the protesters themselves as much as the actions or inactions of our officers. We thought their tactical stance during the DNC was sound. We did not see any use of horses. We did not see riot gear or anything particularly intimidating that would have probably caused a different type of reaction among the folks who came to our city to protest. During the days that we spent covering that particular area and also going back and forth between City Hall and several other marches that took place, we had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people mostly from out of town, who were pretty supportive of what the police were doing. They felt that they were treated properly. They had a chance to air their grievances and protests as they came to our city to do. The arrests that were made at that point right by the Wells Fargo Center were made primarily or exclusively by the Secret Service. It really had to do with I think about a dozen or so folks who actually crossed over the fence. I know several of those cases are still working their way through. Charges have been dropped in some of those. We also heard some complaints about what was described as undercover activity, likely by some of our civil affairs folks in the march that the Black Lives Matter Real Justice folks did from Temple down to City Hall and then on to where the DNC was held. And we're obviously paying attention to those as well. But on the whole, from our observations and from what was told to us, we thought the department did a very good job with how they handled the DNC.
Kelvin, for a moment, before you go on to body cams, because you've been trying to collect information about how the police responded to the DNC, and so we're looking at various sources, and kind of wondering, has anybody have a different opinion about how the police responded during the DNC, anecdotal or otherwise? Okay, so,
I had a friend who came from Seattle she was one of the Bernie people, and she said that she was very impressed with how the police comported themselves, and there was a couple of my other friends were saying that they learned from the RNC a few years back.
Thanks. I mean, we were thinking, part of, as I said when we began, part of what we do is we're trying to work on the relations with the community and with the police, and so I think that means calling out the police when we think there are problems or where the problems are, and also similarly when we think that they have handled a situation appropriately. We're thinking of writing to Commissioner Ross, but we're trying to get a sense of really whether there has been something that we weren't aware of, which I'm sure there is, but I mean generally people that I talk to all have kind of the same feeling that the police maintain the order. Okay, thanks.
Okay, on to body camera policy. I'm going to request that the board authorize us to begin planning public hearings to be held sometime in probably late fall or early winter around the PPD's body camera policy. And here's why. As you can see in the graphic I've included in my report on the left, this is a report from the National Body Camera Policy Scorecard. That's a group that has been collecting and analyzing body camera policies from around the country. As you can see, there are 3 areas which we seem to be doing fairly well in according to their assessment, but there are also some exits there that cause us some concern. I think our biggest concern in having beginning to work through this policy starting late last year with Commissioner Ramsey, or about this time actually last year with Commissioner Ramsey, is number one, the PPD has really not properly included public input in the formation of the body-worn camera policy. If you'll recall, the 21st Century Task Force on Policing headed by Commissioner Ramsey, one of their prime recommendations was that any time a police department forms policy, that citizens should have direct input into the formulation of that policy. PPD's body camera policy is critically important to transparency, critically important to accountability, and we believe that citizens should, as they have in other cities that have put these policies into play, should have direct input to that. You should be able to input as an individual, as a group. That has not occurred in the city. We think that that's a problem. The second thing that we're concerned with is the data or footage retention policy. The current policy that you can find on the police department website has a retention time of 30 days for the footage that officers shoot. By our calculations, that's not enough time to make that camera footage applicable when you file complaints or other critical incidents. The PERF recommendation, or the Police Executive Research Foundation, is a minimum of 60 to 90 days retention for body camera footage. What you see in the graphic I've included on the left here is a graph of how long it takes folks in Philadelphia to file police complaints after there's an underlying incident. Now, I was actually kind of surprised when I ran these numbers from August of 2009 to August of last year. This is a a compilation I did last August as a result of some questions we were having on the PCOB, the other board. But actually, most citizens in Philly, about 72% or so, actually file complaints within 30 days of the incident that occurred. And that's good for a lot of reasons. Obviously, we can gather statements a lot more quickly. People's recollection is fresher. If there's other evidence that needs to be gathered, think of footage from business cameras, other things, stuff that citizens might have shot. The quicker we get to that information and make that part of the complaint process, the more thorough review we can do. So our concern is that if we limit that retention of body camera footage to only 30 days, we're really just at that beginning point of where citizens are filing complaints. As you can see by the rest of the chart, there are plenty of complaints that are filed outside of that 30-day limit. So if I go to request body camera footage that's beyond that 30 days, it's not going to be there because we're not retaining it. And we think that that is a serious problem. Now, I'll say that the pushback we've gotten so far from the department and what then Commissioner Ramsey mentioned when I brought this up last year was that, well, we can't afford to save footage for that long. It's pretty expensive. Right now, Taser really is the only player in the game here. Until we begin to see a number of other vendors actually providing cloud storage service to police departments, Taser has a lock on that, and frankly, as I've tried to look at how much they're charging other cities around the country, it's really all over the place. So part of what we're seeing here is reaction to that lack of vendors. There's not a lot of vendors out there who can do this. Now, this may change. There's been talk at the federal level of actually creating a federal level data storage portal. Some states are even considering using the power of the state to collect all of the body camera footage for the thousands of departments within a state, for example. But at the minimum, though, 30 days is really not enough time to retain footage from our point of view. So one of the things we want to do in a hearing is obviously take testimony from you, from victims groups, from other folks who have an interest in this policy and seeing this actually be useful for transparency and useful to give us some leverage to actually make decisions on complaints that isn't not sustained because we don't have enough information. One of the problems with the complaint system that we found is that frequently if you file a complaint, it's your word against an officer's. If I don't have a definitive witness statement or other information, it's kind of hard to push that one direction or another. So obviously, everyone's hope around the country is that body camera footage is going to help us do a better job in evaluating what actually occurred between citizens and officers in these contentious moments. So those will be some of the things we want to explore in a body camera hearing.
Calvin, a quick question for our guests. What's the initial rollout? How many body cameras are coming to the police department?
There's a few hundred in play now, mostly in the 22nd district up here. That's where the pilot program was. I saw a few officers had them on during the DNC, but not very many. The plan is to gradually roll out a few hundred at a time and to eventually outfit all of the officers in the field over probably a couple years time frame. The stuff that you're actually putting on the material you're actually putting on the cop consists of basically a chest-mounted camera here. That stuff is not expensive. Obviously, it's the cloud storage for all this. I think we're talking something like a gig per officer per shift is one of the estimations I've seen, and that's quite a bit of storage space. That can add up pretty quickly. So. But again, it's very important that we try to get to a point where we're extending that retention period, because we simply don't believe that that's going to be enough for a major city like us to really get any benefit from this technology.
So the retention period during the policy, during the trial phase is 30 days?
During the trial phase, it was actually 14 days. And I should also mention that if there's a critical incident in an event of a shooting or something like that, or an arrest, that footage is automatically saved according to the record retention requirements that already exist. So anytime something serious like that happens, you're already going to have that footage saved. So I'll be able to go and request footage from a shooting, for example, if an officers hopefully are aware of the camera, so we'll get a number of vantage points there. So that's not our concern. Our concern is citizens' complaints, lawsuits, and other types of events that could benefit from the use of this technology. And that's pretty much it for me. We've got, I'm going to be meeting tomorrow with the executive director of the PA Legislative Black Caucus. There are a number of issues on the table at the state level around police accountability, one of which you'll recall came up last year as the FOP objected to the naming of officers who were involved in shootings within 3 days. There's actually a there's a state labor relations board charge on the table that the FOP filed in connection with that policy. They want to make that go away. They also authored a bill with Representative White from the Northeast that would prevent any police department in the state from naming officers who were involved in shootings. And we think that that is also a problematic piece of legislation that we've been talking with our counterparts in Pittsburgh, the Citizen Complaint Review Board there. They're also on record as being against that policy. So my intent tomorrow is to begin to talk to the PA Black Legislative Caucus about our concerns around those bills and concerns about police accountability generally and how state laws are going to affect that. I think we're going to see over the next year or so quite a bit of activity in the state legislature around police accountability, as we've seen in other states around the country. Body camera policy also is on the table. There was just a hearing in Latrobe last week around that. The Pennsylvania News Media Association, I always want to say newspapers because I'm old, but it's the News Media Association, actually testified there and expressed a number of concerns about the length of time that video is retained, the lack of public visibility of body camera footage, etc. So we want you to pay close attention to what happens at the state legislature around many of these police accountability bills that are going to come into play. Special prosecutor, that's another big issue. I've heard that the district attorney is actually going to be holding some forum in the next couple of weeks around whether or not we should use a special prosecutor to deal with officer-involved shootings. And that's something actually that the police department has expressed some interest in. That was also one of the recommendations in the DOJ report over the last couple of years, that we actually have a special prosecutor either from the FBI or from the state attorney general's office whose responsibility it is to look at all police shootings that occur within the state of Pennsylvania. When I last brought this up with the department, we were trying to figure out what that agreement would look like. The state police and the attorney general's office, I think, and the PPD were working on some type of memorandum of understanding that would spell out how that would work.
Thank you. Well, this is the point in the meeting where we'd open it up to public comment. We appreciate all of you coming out on this hot night, so we're really interested in hearing what's on your mind. Please, sir.
Hi, my name is Carl Dash, I'm a Philadelphia resident. For the couple people here, I'm probably responsible for a lot of people here tonight. We kind of created a Facebook event and wanting to come out. I guess one of the first questions I'd like to ask, I'll direct it to Kelvin, but also because I know him a little bit, I know him. What can we do to help you guys if what you guys want to do, besides the idea of improving relationships with the police, which is, you know, a real thing, but there's also that adversarial relationship, unfortunately, that may need to be taken because it seems that there's a digging in the sands by police officers often when there's some sort of conflict in the community. So, but then also sometimes I guess an agency like yours might not be prepared or have an imbalance in resources, and or resolve, not from you guys, just resolving the climate of the city. So what can we do, if anything, because we're going to be ongoing with our communication efforts with each other. We may not all be coming back, maybe other people come back, but we'd like to know what we can do. And maybe that would include, if you guys are going to move into a bigger facility, not just myself and before you would have helped me, but maybe 20 people here will all force their friends to come out. So
Thank you. Do you want to get the conversation
Well,
started?
I think you've done it. You've filled this room for, probably the second or third time this year. I think that's fantastic. It's great to see all you folks out here. There's a couple of things I would ask you to do. Bring us out to your neighborhood. We don't need to be here at all. In fact, I would much rather be in your neighborhood and talking to you directly on the ground and you showing me what happens. And frankly, it doesn't have to happen always in a huge meeting like this. You can invite us out anytime. We may be small, but we try to be responsive to when people ask us to come to do things. If you want me to see something, call me up, I'll come see it. That's not a problem. Programmatically, we're going to be over the next several months in a major discussion on what this body will look like, what our powers are, who's on the board, all those major questions. Weigh in on those. That's all I would say. I'm not going to direct you on which side or this or how to, just weigh in. That, as long as you're expressing the need for us to be doing a job, the folks over at City Hall are going to hear you. And that's really what we need you to do. Tell the politicians what you think oversight should be doing.
Follow-up question to that then. Which city council agency, I guess it's, I don't know the exact name of the agency, Kurt Jones is the one that oversees it. Do they have regularly scheduled hearings or whatever? Or do you,
sure, you're speaking of Councilman Jones's Public Safety Committee, which is where we would come under. And actually, I'm talking to Councilman about the body camera policy hearing. I'm hoping that's something that they'll have an interest in. So, yeah, that is the part of City Council which is responsible in part for appointments to the commission. When as you see now, we've only got 8 members. So, of the 19 that we're currently slated for, 15 of those are regular members, 8 appointed directly by the mayor, 7 by City Council. So, what you want to do is talk to Councilman Jones about, well, commission is not, the board is not fully, set up. How come? We need to get some more people on the board, press for more diversity on the board, obviously. That's something that our chair brought up last month. Those are the areas where you really need to be giving the politicians some pressure.
Can we post some information? Sorry. Can we post some information on our website and on our Facebook page so that people can follow along and get a sense of what's happening with the discussion, so you'll know kind of where you're weighing in on it?
And one of the things you ask your public officials, you say, the Police Advisory Commission has 3 investigators, and the police department has how many?
I think Internal Affairs has about 120 or more.
So you can see how disproportionate that is. So your civilian oversight agency really has no personnel to do it. Most of the personnel are in the police department, which puts people at a disadvantage because they don't feel like they want to complain about the police to the police.
Right.
But we do a wonderful amount of work with a really handful of employees. So that's something you can always bring up if you're serious about civilian oversight.
Oh, I'm very serious.
That's
why I'm asking that question.
How about a few more people?
What has been discussed in this room that's actually been implemented with the FOP? Is there anything that you can maybe give me an example out of? Or just a situation where you guys get all this fantastic data, right? And you're able to empathize with this, and you send it over to FOP and they just tie it up in court or say they don't have the money for it.
Right.
Is that what happens?
It's always tied up in
Well,
court.
not
But wait, you want to talk about, you want to respond to the
I mean,
recommendations that have been adopted, then we'll let the
Yeah, no,
gentleman
I want to ask this question. There are definitely some things that have gone well. I can give you one good example from the past, and that's crisis intervention training. We talk a lot now about de-escalation. Everybody talks about de-escalating incidents. You get into it with a cop, you need the cops to be trained well about how to keep their cool, how to understand, how to communicate with different folks, etc. The root of that in Philadelphia came about as a collaboration between the commission, mental health advocates, and the mental health advocacy and behavioral health community. When we, around 2004 or so, we looked at officer-involved shootings and said, of about 20 every year, probably 10 to 15 of those involve folks who have some type of mental illness. So officers who did not understand how to deal with that were in fact shooting and killing people unnecessarily, to be very frank about it. We changed that over a period of a couple of years by looking at other cities. What were other cities doing with this? There was something called the Memphis model, which you'll hear about in crisis intervention training. Memphis was one of the first police departments to really take a hold of this problem and begin to come up with ways of training officers and connecting them to the behavioral health providers so they could really do a much better job with that. One of the things we found out was that officers didn't know where to take people in crisis. Even if they were well-minded and understood, okay, this guy's got a problem, they didn't know where to take them. So that required a response by our behavioral health community. Now, those two segments of our government work quite well together, and we reduced those incidents to be very low. Now, we still have some incidents. One of the things I want to study, and the reason why I'm asking for more people, is we started to look at taser usage, for example. We started using tasers more when we started dealing with crisis intervention training, because that's one of the tools that officers use. And they work well, but they can also be misused as well, or they could just not work well. You need to know how they're being used. We've never done a study in this department of how tasers are used. So we've just started to gather some information. I've got some preliminary information. I've got more questions, but I've also only got 4 people who are split between dealing with formal investigations, doing policy analysis, doing community outreach, all those things. So until we have enough people at each one of those points to operate, we're not going to be as effective as we can and give the department as much pushback and support, frankly, when they're doing good things. So I think that's a good example of how, if you think about it properly and begin to draw in folks from all over the place, you can do that. Now we have folks who are suffering from mental health crisis doing the training. They're the ones who train the cops because they know what those encounters are like. So we've done pretty well with that.
To shine a light on some of the core problems of what happens, like the arbitration system that returns cops to the force, and then it makes it difficult in this system to discipline cops. We've been certainly concerned that if there's no solid way to discipline folks who are doing wrong, then there's not a lot of incentive to change that behavior. And so, I get your concern about, so we have great data, and then what? So we're trying to put the data out there so that people can, kind of champion some of these causes.
Same thing with the pedestrian and vehicle stops. You asked one of the things you can do, go to those PSA and district level meetings and ask the commanders, what are the stops you're doing in your neighborhood? Or hopefully what I'm going to be able to do is provide you with data on what happens in your PSA or your district, so you can know on the ground. You can look out your door and say, I live at 49th in Baltimore, for example, so I want to be able to know, I know basically what happens in a few block areas in my neighborhood because I'm out there. I walk my dogs. I'm always out talking to people. I know what happens there. So if you tell me that officers are making stops here or there, I'm going to have a pretty good idea of what's happening in my section. I suspect that y'all will too. So if I arm you with that information, that's going to allow you to ask the police commanders a lot more pointed questions about what happens in that area. That's why we're trying to not only get the data that's out there now, but we're trying to also get the data on who the officers are involved and also who the folks who are being stopped are. Because I know we got folks who've been stopped 10, 15, 20 times probably, but we're not really hearing from them, and we need to hear from them too.
Sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Carl Jones, and I'm from Philadelphia resident.
Yes, sir.
There are more chairs up in front for folks.
One of the questions, I actually have 2 questions. One, in regards to something you mentioned earlier about the body cam.
Yes, sir.
What accountability can this commission hold police officers to if they begin to use practices that have been used in other cities
where during an altercation or an incident, somehow the camera falls or fails to function?
Well, the rules that are, the one area I think that the current policy, the temporary policy that's being developed to a full policy is pretty strong is there are penalties for fiddling with the camera, and they're pretty severe. So if we find any officers fiddling with the cameras or doing something to disable them, then that's going to be a problem. Now, in terms of them falling off and stuff like that, I think that that's an equipment issue. I've not seen that in the pilot that's been going on. We've been looking at some of the reports that are out there, and I've not seen a single body camera fall off on an officer here in Philly.
But nationally speaking,
Right.
that has happened in
Right.
some high-profile cases.
Sure, it happened in Baton Rouge, both of them.
Right.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
How's that
No, I
possible?
mean, I agree with you. It gives me pause too, but again, in looking at what I've seen so far, and I've seen footage in probably 2 or 3 officer-involved shootings that around, I've not seen that to be a problem. I mean, obviously, we're going to pay attention to it, but I've not seen that to be a problem.
Well, as a concerned citizen,
Sure.
actually fits the profile of somebody that would be considered suspicious in the city.
Sure,
Um,
sure. No, I'm suspicious. I respect that.
It's an issue because what you'll find is when there are other people recording these incidents, there's sort of a witch hunt for the whistleblower.
Right.
And their stories, the stories and the official reports from the police don't often match up with the actual video recorded account of what happens. So that's just one question. And two, in terms of, you know, if you do get a chance to build up your team like, you know, you're looking forward to, what teeth does this commission actually have to hold people accountable?
You. We cannot, I'm gonna be straight up with you. I can't fire officers. I can recommend that the police department do so. But to be honest, I want access to absolutely everything that every officer does, not just the things that are gonna lead to firings. Most cops, for what goes on, even most types of misconduct are not things that cops are gonna necessarily be fired or punished for. So if we concentrated only on offenses that were fireable or were punishable in some way, we would miss so much of what happens. And I'll back you up to what I was trying to, the point I was trying to make about the way we tackle the mental health issue. We saw the problem manifest itself in shootings there. That was obviously a horrible example, but there were plenty of other encounters between citizens and police that were not fatals, that never got looked at, that never got considered in terms of how to figure out what the problem is. And that's where you want to go. We want to be able to look at every single thing that all officers do, not just the ones who are involved in the shootings, not just the 800 or so complaints that come through the department every year. We want to be able to look at every single thing officers do and then make some judgments as to how we can improve that, or how we can make some change either on the police end or some other part of government to make those things work better together.
And also, we as commissioners, and sometimes instead of banging our heads, you know, trying to discipline a police officer, we have found ourselves making, you know, policy consideration changes, like no private cell phone use, no courtesy calls, and then the police department responds positively to that. So, because we found that through the arbitration system, you know, we're pretty powerless to, you know, take on any police officer, but maybe we can effect institutional change that things we see that go bad, we stop them. So that's how we try to, you know.
We have the authority to make recommendations, and so what we need is, you know, all of your support to make sure that those recommendations are taken seriously, you know, taken to your elected officials, taken to the media. You know, it's your strength that's going to make them look at those recommendations. Similarly, your point about the body camera, I mean, that's right. So what's that protocol going to be? That's why we need your input. We're going to convene some hearings, and we want the police department to hear from the city about what you think is important and why, and so that the rules are shaped that way.
Well, isn't the, and this is my last part, and I'm going to shut up, let everybody have a chance to talk, but isn't the city and the police department, aren't they in negotiations for a new contract? And does this board have any influence over the new policies or procedures that will be considered into that new contract.
I think that we have the opportunity to kind of generate some noise with your help about that so that there are issues on the table that can't be ignored.
Yeah, and again, I think people are paying attention to police contracts, and I'm really happy with particularly the National Black Lives Matter folks for collecting contracts from around the country and laying them out there for people to see. Because you're absolutely right, and we are not a party to the negotiations, but I guarantee you that any move that's made to change parts of the contract that affect discipline, that affect how the body camera policies work, that affect accountability or allowing officers to be named in shootings, things like that are things that I think the public is going to make noise about, and certainly we're going to do the same.
Who is making those decisions about that?
Well, I mean, it's a negotiation like any other negotiation between a union and the municipality. Those are the people at the table. You and I are not at the table
What
with that.
specific people?
Yeah, if I
The
may-
law department, right, there's a group within the law department that spends their time laying out what the city's positions are. And then obviously there are going to be key people within the administration itself that are going to drive how that goes, what that back and forth is.
What
Can
Calvin
I-
is,
Go ahead, please.
with what Calvin is saying, if you all feel like the police advisory commission doesn't have the power to get, to do what it needs to do, we need you. We serve you. We're just volunteers. Everyone works here, but we all need you for this.
So
I guess to ask, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. One of the recommendations we were talking about, contracts, I work for the federal government. And one of the things that we have is that, like, when managers, for example, have labor issues, and those sorts of complaints have to go all the way to Congress. And what happens is that if there's a settlement or something like that, that comes out of that agency's budget. So basically what happens is that they're very cognizant of training those managers to say, you can't violate, our union agreement or this or that. So one of the recommendations I think that maybe you can look into is that if we continue to have 800 complaints, that's ridiculous. 800 complaints a year, and the city is constantly settling with people because of police conduct. It needs to start coming out of the police budget. Right. That's what it needs to start doing. Because when you start taking money from people, they start to sit up and notice that, and that is punishment.
Police each other.
Exactly. They start to police each other. And I think that will start to break down the blue wall of bullshit, the silence that they use in order to say, I was scared, the body camera fell off, whatever, because you then can tie it to, this is dollars and cents. And that's what it is, because we're paying for being harassed. That's basically what's happening.
Well, and we think similarly, because one of our proposals was, instead of funding the Police Advisory Commission separately, give us a percentage of what the Philadelphia Police Department has. We would take 0.5% of their budget. But it's that similar kind of thought,
I want to
spread the money out a little
We
bit.
just have to be careful because that money's going to start coming from, there are going to be fewer police officers, policing the neighborhoods that we need to have police. So it really is, what about the leadership of the police leadership? We're talking about training for officers, we're talking about putting body cameras on.
Right.
These are nitpicky little fixes that we're talking about as opposed to a systemic problem in the leadership. These new cops don't come in, go into training and possibly excited about being police officers with racial, profiling in mind. It starts somewhere and it's been there and it hasn't gone anywhere. Right. Even with black leadership in the police department.
Yeah, I want to offer a comment that kind of ties together a couple of things here. One of the other issues that's somewhat unique to the Philadelphia union here is we have a single union for all of the officers and we just talked about supervision, right? Very important in how this all works. We've got all these great policies coming down, but if you don't have supervisors at the street level who are making sure your officers are making constitutional stops, for example, then you got a problem. Here's an issue with the Philly setup. We have a single union that represents everyone from deputy commissioners all the way down to the patrol officer. So that causes a bit of a problem there, if you might imagine, at Internal Affairs when the officer who's the subject of the complaint by someone who's also in the same union as he is. So, you know, again, that's another contractual issue that's somewhat unique to Philadelphia. New York police example, they have like 5 or 6 unions. They have a union for sergeants, lieutenants, they have a patrol officers union. Very different makeup. So those are a number of issues too that we need to get at in the contract.
And another question I was curious about, are there quotas that cops have to reach when they're patrolling the streets of how many tickets they give out? Because I always wondered about that, because I felt as though if so, that could also be part of the problem when they feel as though they have to stop somebody for high beams that are not on. I was stopped months ago because they said my high beams were on and they never were.
Yeah.
Or when they say a tail light is out and it's not. So if it's a quota that's supposed to be reached, I don't know if this is true or not, is there anything that we can do about that in terms of the leadership, the people above them?
That type of patrol strategy, I guess we could call it, that really comes out with your whistleblowers. So in New York, for example, you got a bunch of black cops who have actually recorded supervisors telling them that they have to do X, Y, Z. You're supposed to do. Now, again, I've not really seen that to be an issue here in Philly. It may be. I've not seen any evidence to that. But you know, again, there's clearly, and a lot of times the pressure will come, frankly, from us. Because if I got somebody hanging out on my stoop and I'm trying to get rid of folks on my stoop and I'm calling the cops, I want to see somebody show up and do something. So again, when we think about at that district and police service area level, what's actually happening with vehicle and pedestrian stops, one of the other pieces of data we're trying to lay on the side of this is calls for service. I want to know, what are the calls for service in my particular small police service area? How does that compare to who's being stopped, when and why? Who's doing the stopping? Who are they actually stopping? All those questions are very important to try and unravel.
Let me get that, please.
My question is just quick. When you're gathering the data from the police, is it, so every single time they stop somebody, it's written down, like every single time?
Yep. Now,
I only ask that because I know that a lot of the advice is coming from data, a data set. But I don't live there now, but where I grew up, I couldn't imagine that they were writing down paperwork for every time. Because I've actually seen police officers stop somebody at the top of the corner, the middle of the block, the end of the block, and turn the corner and stop. And I can't imagine that. I'm an attorney. You can't write that stuff up that quickly. So that's why I'm saying, like how do we know when they stop someone and they're not arresting them, they're just throwing them against the wall, frisking them, they're jumping back in their car and leaving? Where's that data coming from?
Well, again, the reason we know this is because of the 7548A, which is the form that they have to fill out for pedestrian stops here in Philly. We put that into play many years ago now and actually continue to revise that form. So, you know, if you make a stop without filling out the proper paperwork, you can get punished for that. And I have seen people get punished for not doing that paperwork correctly. So if you've got officers who for some reason are, you know, trying to skirt the requirements of recording what they have, and there's plenty of ways to see that. There's calls that come into you know, police radio that generate things like that. There's you know, and in fact now that, thank goodness that the ACLU made this an issue and there's a consent decree, every inspector is looking at every single stop that all the officers make. They're under tremendous pressure to deal with this issue, and it's a serious issue in the city. More serious actually than it is in New York.
Let's hit the question in the back and work around the room, and then we come back to this gentleman. Dan, did you have a question?
Just a concerned citizen. What is the prevailing attitude from the police department in regards to this type of setting? The reason that being asked is it will determine how many of us use our voices. And so if it's respected, then our voice is a little different. But if it's like I treat my children where it's like, okay, I respect what you're saying, but you want to do what I'm going to say anyway, then that will determine how I voice how when you come to these type of settings.
Sure.
So what is the prevailing attitude from the police department to this?
I think it depends on who you talk to. If you're talking to
I just prefer to
anyone, well, I'm gonna break it down for you. If you're talking to anybody basically from, say, the lieutenant's level and up, they know who we are. We deal with them constantly. I'm constantly calling them up with issues that you brought up, either in a complaint or something less formal. People call the office. I'm immediately, or one of my staff is on the phone to tell a PSA lieutenant, look, somebody just called me about this or that. Can you handle that, please? Or I email them and make sure I get a response, things like that. Once you begin to drop down below the supervisor level, I think the reaction is going to be mixed. There's going to be an automatic reaction from some patrol officers.
The lieutenants aren't the one doing the arresting. So we're dealing with those that are from the supervisor down. And so if the majority of the instances are from the supervisor down and there's a prevailing attitude of uncaring or lack of empathy, then we have a real issue.
Right. Well, again, one of the things I think that we like that Commissioner Ramsey did is he placed the responsibility for dealing with the patrol officers who aren't doing the right thing squarely at that middle management level. So if there are issues with officers not making constitutional stops, or making unconstitutional stops or vehicle stops, then that needs to be dealt with first at that supervisory level. And I think you're going to see a tremendous amount of pressure on the middle supervisors to improve and to be able to report up the chain that, yeah, I dealt with officer so-and-so because he made 5 or 6 unconstitutional stops last year. Here's what I did to deal with that. Likewise, we're going to be looking at that. One of the things we're trying to figure out is, what are the punishments that have been handed out for officers who are stopping people unfairly 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 times? So what does that punishment piece look like?
Ma'am? Hi. You mentioned a couple times the public hearing around body camera policy. That seemed like a really concrete way that the public could get involved. So I was wondering, one, if there's a concrete date for the hearing. Second, if and when there's a date, how people can get registered to testify and how people can prep themselves on something that's probably complicated.
Absolutely, thanks, Jay. Yeah, we just started this. I just made a formal request to the board tonight to go forward with this. I suspect that I will probably get some assistance from City Council. We'll see. We're looking to do this probably sooner rather than later. I'm saying probably late September, early October, as the contract is actually let. The other piece of this is that the department has an RFP out that should be coming out any time now for the actual camera equipment itself, and that's also an important piece of this, and will also help determine where the whole thing ends up, particularly that data retention requirement. So if we're looking to hold this hearing and take public comments over, say, a month or so, we're probably looking at maybe 1 or 2 days in City Council, people actually testifying live. We're going to give you an opportunity to weigh in other ways as well. We'll bring in a couple of local and national experts around body cameras so you can get a flavor of what other communities have done, et cetera. So I guarantee you will have plenty of opportunity to comment either live, in some digital form or some other way.
And we'll try to promote all of that in social media so folks can follow it. Let me just, if I may, work this way around the room to give folks an opportunity. Please.
I wanted to ask about the other side of the spectrum. In your neighborhoods where you feel like police are worried about stopping and frisking when you have constant violence on your street. When you call the police, they don't come. So, I mean, is that an issue that's addressed within this committee? I mean,
good question. Yeah, I think that's absolutely something we can get at. And again, that's why I want to put more data on the table. Like, I want to know what it looks like for a particular area, what types of calls they're getting, what people are reporting, and then on the other side, what is the police response to that? If you're reporting, for example, a large number of break-ins or other type of crime, then I'm going to look at, all right, how well are they doing to get at that? Or are there so many lack of service complaints in that area that we're really not getting officers out to respond to that?
Things like consistent violence in a particular house, on the street, constantly.
Right.
And you know, when you can't even let your child go outside and play, and I feel like they just don't address it at all, you know, but they're so worried about my fiance parking his car on the sidewalk and checking in for warrants, you know, so.
That's the kind of thing, if you let me know sort of where the area that you're concerned about, then we can begin to kind of drill down and figure that out, absolutely.
Sir?
One of the questions with the police contract coming out, and we see through police-involved incidents where some police officers are even fired, but through the arbitrary process, they get their job back with back pay.
Yep.
Then a civil complaint comes out, a civil litigation comes out, and a victim is awarded a judgment, which comes from the city again.
Yep.
Is there a way to craft language which makes individual officers responsible for a portion of that settlement? Because when you, the best way to combat a lot of things, you hit, like they hit you in your pocket. If an officer knows that they may take my pension from this, I'm less likely to right, I will think twice. I will be more empathetic in de-escalating a situation. If I know in the back of my mind, my pension is gone, I may lose my house. Not the whole judgment, because we see millions of dollars in judgment, but a portion of that. Why should the citizens, through our tax dollars, be incurred the injustice of being stopped, then the officer's getting back pay, and then having to pay for their bad judgment, and the officer goes off?
Absolutely.
As a way to kind of leverage that a little bit, because the main thing you want to do is try to get someone to stop and pause and think. Because I have a lot of friends who are police officers, good cops, but they say even then, a lot of people just do not stop. They don't stop and think until it's too late.
That's exactly the thing that I was talking about.
Yeah, I think the difficulty there is separating officers who would benefit from additional training, who can be retaught, who can actually police in the way that we want, from those officers who they want, no matter what the rules are. I don't think liability or any of that matters to folks who are like that. So we can change the rules if we want to kind of make it harder or hit the cop in the pocket or something. But for those officers who frankly should not be on the force, I don't think that's going to work for them either.
But it has to start somewhere, though.
No, I respect that, but I think again, with the arbitrations, for example, if you look at our arbitration report, the number of times, we looked at 25 instances over 3 years where officers actually got their job back. So keep in mind, there are maybe 100 or more arbitrations every year. So the number of arbitrations that actually lead to an officer getting their job back is fairly small. It's not what you think, because you see that, and most glaringly, we're looking at those 6 narcotic officers who got their jobs back. We all saw that. And so that makes you think, oh, well, cops always get their jobs back. It's more nuanced than that. So we want to be careful in how we craft our response to be able to get at, and I want to capture those officers who are doing a good job and who are capable of policing our neighborhoods the way we want them. I want their support in order to make this thing better. So we want to be very nuanced in our approach towards that.
But I think we also want to keep asking that question about arbitration.
Yeah.
I mean, keep asking that question of us and of others. You know, what's the incentive to change your behavior if there's no consequences?
But as a follow-up.
How about just hire, you know, change the hiring practices or the training practices? Because doing all this stuff on the back end is a waste of time, money, and effort, energy.
We've actually just lowered the hiring.
Right.
You want to respond to that?
That's a tricky
Especially
question.
for arbitration, I think one of the things that, one of the more difficult things is how do we find those, so to speak, bad officers? I was going to bring this up earlier, and I think I mentioned it before. I think the department really needs something I like to call integrity checks, where you actually you have a call, but the officer doesn't know if it's an actual call or if he's just or the check just say okay, maybe I should be on my game. Because I don't know. Yeah, because I don't know if
They do that.
Yeah.
They do that. They do have the part of internal affairs. Now, again, what I don't know is how efficient that is and how well it works. We also have what's called an early warning system. And now, the way that works is if an officer uses force a certain number of times, catches a certain number of complaints, in fact, now they've brought it down to 1. If you get a single complaint now, I'm your captain, you're coming in and we're gonna have a little conversation about what's happening with you out there. Now, to the extent that that might, you know, improve, if there's a problem with you or something else, to the extent that that might improve your performance and make you be a better officer, that's good. But that also gives us an opportunity to make certain that, you know, we're paying attention to every single thing that the officers are doing on the street.
And that's something that I really wanted to look into. I wasn't sure if the department actually did that. That was my question, but you answered it.
Yeah.
You know, so I think we should definitely look into that.
What's your name, bro?
Evan.
You're Evan?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
His nameplate is.
Yeah, he's over there.
Oh, it's funny.
Sorry. I'll pull him out for y'all.
So, good evening, I'm a concerned resident, I'm also a mother of preteens. Yes, that's loaded, right? So, in terms of, you mentioned that there's been de-escalation training, are officers also trained in implicit bias? Is that something that's being discussed now, something that's being put forward soon? And also in terms of this administration, this commissioner, a lot of police forces will say, and leadership will say, that it's not a systemic problem, it's a problem of bad apples, right? And we have to try to root out the bad apple. So, you know, we could go back and forth about whether it's systemic or individual. Let's take that as individual. You had mentioned, I think a little bit, Mr. Anderson, an early warning system for folks who are getting repeated complaints. But at what point does this commission kind of notice that there's a red flag as you're looking at these complaints? If there's an officer, what's the threshold, right, for determining that there needs to be a real intervention? Because I think if you go to many communities and many police districts, folks can point out the bad apples. If we're going to bring it to an individual level, not really look at it as a systemic problem, which of course we should. But just like bad teachers, people know who the bad officers are. So how involved has the commission gotten in that? And the question about implicit bias.
Excellent question. Implicit bias first. Last year, partly as a result of everything that's going on with DOJ, we did the first supervisor training right here in this building of implicit bias. We brought in a couple of national experts to talk directly with supervisors about explicit bias, how that works, what that means for you as a patrol officer. They're going to expand that training not just to the supervisors, but out to the entire department over the next year or so. So I thought that that was a very positive thing that we're doing. So we haven't gotten it out to the entire force yet, but we are working on it.
Is that from the DOJ report?
Yes, it is. That was a result of one of the recommendations of the DOJ.
But I have a question about what that training looks like. Is that, are you actually assessing, or are you recommending that they're administering actual implicit bias tests? Or is an implicit bias expert standing up in front of a group of people and determining what it is? Or is the department going to get an idea? Because it's a very different story to say, well, I've been trained on implicit bias versus this particular, you know, if you've ever taken an implicit bias exam, this particular officer is definitely, there's a bias in this person, whether they knew it or not. So what is that training going to look like? Is it ongoing?
Right. Well, again, you know, I did not take the training, so I can't answer your question in much detail other than to say I know that it's the department's intention that all officers get trained on that. Now, should there be some type of evaluation component attached to that? Maybe you're right about that. I would definitely be interested in figuring out how that would work. And I would also like to see the training not be at the advanced level where it is here, which is we're getting it here only in Philly. It should be embedded in the basic police curriculum that you get in that first, when you're first an officer, not something that's specialized afterwards. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
There needs to be a disqualifying factor. I mean, based on that exam, and they have to be disqualified. You cannot send somebody out there, especially in a certain environment, and that's the problem. They give these psychological exams, but there's got to be questions that can determine someone who has a bias, who's prejudiced, there has to be, and they have to be disqualified, and they cannot be put on the streets.
I think actually, but
everyone has a certain bias to a certain degree. Now I know the department has in their initial process where you actually take a implicit or bias test. I don't know how in depth that it is,
But are they getting disqualified? And then there's always, there's more boards of reviews. They can keep going and keep going. And then you're gonna get that one person that's gonna slide them through. And that's the problem.
How many biases are causing lives though? I mean, like, there's a difference in saying, you know, certain people cook chicken better, or, you know, as opposed to this person is inherently, you know, dangerous.
And you're putting them in a position where they can single out a culture constantly because of the color of their skin.
You need training. Like I was
I don't think you can train that.
No, I had to work part-time in
train
Bloomingdale's. I had to do a lot of people. Do you like use your card today? It's still people
But you're
skills.
you're not
It's
a
still
position of
people
authority.
skills.
But when
But
you're
it's-
put in a position of
You
authority,
still need people skills. I think half
I
of
don't
this
think
stuff
you
will
can
be
train that.
avoided
You're
if
right.
cops
I don't think
had
you can
better
train that.
policing,
You can't.
better people
The best
skills.
way, I
got
think,
these
to
young,
approach that
I'm sorry to
would
classify these
You
young
wouldn't
white
get
men
to
out here,
know.
they come out here and they think they're the shit and they think that they own the world and they can do anything, because I see it, I live with it, I watch it every day.
There can definitely be a cutoff point for that evaluation, but I think the best route would definitely be to understand that we all had that bias. And once you recognize that, you can take a step, if you're an officer, you can take a step back and just say, hey, wait a minute, you know, I'm doing this wrong, I should, you know, but.
And should you be doing a particular job with that bias though, you know? Like when you're in a position of, like you said, authority. What Evan's trying to tell you is we'll all come up on that, you'll all come up with a problem on that test. But the training, we're not walking around with guns, some of us are, but the but awareness training and having consequences, and understanding that if I don't do this part of my job well, then I am not gonna have the job is.
Understand, I am not stopping a criminal, I'm stopping a person first.
Right.
Before I think he's a criminal. Not with the attitude this person did something wrong on
I just want to ask Kelvin if you can answer the second question about what folks can do when they see that bad apple in their neighborhood. What's the best suggestion?
Well, your first line of attack there obviously is to communicate that to their direct supervisor by getting to know, again, the lieutenants and folks who run your particular police service area, and also the captain who is over the district where you live in. Going to those meetings, learning who the officers are, getting your face known so that when you have a concern about that, you know exactly who to go to and you take it to them. If they don't deal with it, right. If they do not deal with that, then you move on up the chain, either to us, to internal affairs, to both of us, and then we take things from there.
But I think this is part of the problem. If my brother's acting up, I'm not going down the street and ask the neighbor to get my brother. I'm getting my brother. So I see what you're saying. You want us to speak up, but the other officers have to speak up as well. They also know.
Well, keep in mind, well, let me address that too. They do. Let me tell you why. Think about complaints. You got citizens' complaints followed by you and I, that's one set. You got internal complaints, all right? You want to know what the sustained rate for internal complaints is? 50%. You know what it is for citizens? About 13 or 14% in Philly, probably 7 or 8 or 9% in other areas around the country. Why is that? Because if I'm an officer and I go to the trouble to actually report something, I've probably got a pretty good basis for why that has occurred. So it's not true that officers don't report each other, it's that they're not supported when they do that. What happens when they go to the trouble of doing that is they find themselves isolated on the street by officers who don't want to be part of that. And that's where the cultural change that we need to see in officers come in. That's why I'm asking you to do that, because I know that if you're reporting that officer, guess what? When I pull up his jacket, oh look, he's got 2 internals too, same thing. Oh look, and here's another citizen's complaint. So that's where the pressure point comes in.
I have 2 fast questions. One, you talked about this and I've been thinking about this for like an hour. Maybe it's something you want to ask later, answer in another forum that I'll talk about that with you. But what is the state of transparency? Because some of these statistics that you think would help us as a public feel better about, we're not privy to them at all.
Sure.
Maybe I know a lot of talented people, some in this room, and if you guys have deficiencies, have resource lacks some places,
sure.
I know the best scenario is to have, you know, the city increase your budget, but maybe we can have volunteer committees to work on different aspects of it.
Absolutely.
And I'll definitely try to coordinate that with some people I know here.
Or several of you can be commissioners, there's no secret.
Well, that's
There's
cool.
Citizen
But
commissioners,
there's
there's
5 people that other than
No, well, yeah, again, one of the reasons that we've emphasized so much on increasing our ability to get information out of the department and report it to you, the public, is just this discussion here. This is one of the liveliest, most involved, detailed discussions I've had with a group of citizens since I've been at the commission, in this room right here. And this is where we need to get to if we're going to begin to unravel all these various things. So I'm quite happy to dig into, and to be honest too, the department has been very open, particularly after the DOJ came in and said you got to give PAC all those shooting files. They've been very open with giving us information, and we've stopped. When we first started, all we would ask for is give us information about the case that Carl filed. And we go through Carl's case, and then we make a decision about it. Now I'm like, no. I want to see every single stop you did. I want to see every shooting. I want to see every single piece of paper that's there, and we're going to figure out how that relates to all of these different problems, both individually and systemically. So that's why we're trying to bring all that information to you to stimulate this discussion.
So, in regards to that, and follow up on the transparency piece, you spoke earlier about 6 police officers, narcotics police officers, who are responsible for, when it's all said and done, close to 250 cases being overturned because of
more to come too.
Inappropriate conduct. The one police officer who testified against the other police officers is the only one that got in jail time. So when we talk about creating policy or changing things from a cultural standpoint of the police department, you know, what initiatives are taking place to work, because that sounds like something that's enforced or protected from higher up. When you have a situation like that, and it's not, I mean, how many different times is the 39th district going to be featured for all the cases and people that's released from jail?
Yeah. Well, I would say with the narcotics teams in particular, and you saw Ramsey try to get at this by what? Trying to change the contract. The problem with the narcotics teams is that, just as we've been discussing here, what's that first pressure point? The supervisor on the street. Those narcotics teams operate more so than most of the rest of the department in complete secrecy by definition of what they do. So if you get a bad supervisor and a bunch of folks in his or her charge doing stuff that they want to do, as we saw with this group, you got a serious problem. The way to change that is if I were Ramsey or a Commissioner Ross or anybody, you need to be able to move people around when you see things like that developing. In fact, as a matter of course, most narcotics supervisors and narcotics teams in departments around the country understand that that's a problem. There's a lot of temptation there. So if you move people around, then you break up those cliques of folks who are, tend to get together and do bad things as a group. And
now,
that's what you need to see happen.
Speaking of that, and I promised last time, this time I really promised. Speaking to that issue, it doesn't escape my mind that the one officer happened to be a black police officer, and we're seeing all over the country that when there is a swift or turn, or when law enforcement is punished, it's often the black police officers that are punished. So we're seeing a racial disparity even within these departments. I don't like using words like minority, because when you say that, it sort of like eliminates the blackness. And we have a real issue with black people being protected by people who are sworn in to protect and serve. So when we start talking about those issues and talking about bringing it to the forefront, I don't care too much about, like I said, the diversity aspect. I want to know that culturally speaking, that it's not being ingrained in these training police academies. Yeah. It's not being forecast, my community is not being overly saturated with police officers who are more concerned about whatever, but them to protect and serve. And I say that because I videotaped a young sister on the corner of my block being, I would say, harassed by about 5 or 6 different squad cars full of police officers during a traffic stop. And I believe the only reason she wasn't yanked out of her car is because I was recording the incident as it occurred. Now, in saying that, there's been a lot of police activity on my block over the last few days, and I had an encounter with a police officer yesterday. A white police officer, I want to be clear about that, who tried to really give me a breakdown of my community and what needs to be done in order to fix my community. And he started hanging these trinkets, you know, talking about how much money he makes a year and this, that, and the other. How much he can afford and how I should be helping him recruit more black people to be police officers. But the whole idea of his idea of my culture was that my culture, sorry, tripping over here. That our culture is based on the glittery things, the shimmery things, the shiny things. So that shows me you don't understand my culture, and you're out here on the police, you out here with a badge and a gun, and you have the power to take somebody's life at the drop of a dime, because culturally you have a misunderstanding of what I represent. You have a misunderstanding of what the community represents, but yet and still, my community is full of white police officers and some black ones that see us as a problem that can be solved by waving, you know, a carrot in front of us. Yeah. And that's not the case. And we need to know, culturally speaking, what can this commission put together, I'd say initiatives or whatever, to change that particular apparatus. I think it's good to talk about the fact that there's going to be an integrity check, but that needs to start at the beginning. Right. Not something that you infuse. And then two, what governing agencies are going to look over this? Because if it's just members of the police department that are providing this oversight, then it's just the same old, same old. Yep.
Right. Well, you know, again, I think as my friend over here said a while back, it starts at the beginning when you hire people. And we've been talking about, you know, the notions around implicit bias, what that means, what that implies for our recruiting process and our assessment of folks as they begin to come into the department. But I think now the visibility of police actions is such in our culture now that when I started this job back in 2004, we were not seeing half of what happens. Everything is out there now. The department is forced to put it out there. We've got much work to do to consider how to figure this out from several different points. From the beginning point of where we hire officers, to what we do with officers who do the wrong thing, to how we support officers to do the right thing, all the way through to what it is we expect from community members and what community members can teach officers about what we want to see in our police department. So I tend to think of it along that continuum. There's a lot of work to be done in all of those particular areas, and we cannot afford to let any of that go.
Let's get a question here and then here, please.
Nicholas O'Rourke with Power Philadelphia's Organized Police Department Bill. Just curious about the temperament of Commissioner Ross. I've heard a lot about Commissioner Ramsey and all the things that he's done to try to curb some of this, but I'm curious, now that we have a new commissioner, what is the mentality around any of the stuff that's being done or the ideas the community is giving to have some changes in policing? Is there an acceptance of it, or is there kind of pushback? What are we dealing with now with this new commissioner?
Well, you know, my sense is that Commissioner Ross is going to continue what Commissioner Ramsey started, at least in terms of working through all of the many changes that the Justice Department said are necessary as a result of the shooting incidents. On top of that, everything that's in the 21st Century Task Force report about responding to citizens, letting citizens have input on policy formulation, et cetera. So I think that in my workings with Commissioner Ross, I think he certainly, as a leader of the department, supports those notions. Now, what we have to look at, of course, the devil's in the details, as they say. So I'm going to be making some assessments over what disciplinary actions he's making as the chief executive over the next several months or years or whatever. So we'll have, in some time, we'll be able to see which cases has he made, taking the commissioner's discretion and making specific decisions on. So we'll be able to see from that, what his attitude towards discipline is and how he uses discipline to, build more confidence among the public in what's going there. So we don't know yet. We're going to have to see.
And also, your question was, who in addition to us is looking into this? Well, the Department of Justice will be back in Philadelphia with a report on what they found. And when they came to our meeting 2 months ago, they were pretty candid about how recalcitrant the police department is. So there's some force there, some weight there, that they have some solid recommendations, solid changes they want to see, and that there's some penalties if the city doesn't measure up there as well.
So my question becomes like, how do you keep track of police officers who are trying to create crime in the community? I'm only 19 years old, guys, and as a kid growing up, like I see most of the time, like me and my friend were just walking down the block, just from school, and police officers like pull us over, and like one of my friends, we would say, why are we being pulled over? And they use aggressive violence on us to like check us or pull us over the hood, and for no freaking reason. So how do we determine? How do you guys keep track of those police officers? Because as a kid, I didn't know that I have the right to file complaints. Like, how do we educate millennials and people who are my age to know that they have certain rights and they could do something about it? Because that's a problem. We don't know. As a kid, I didn't know that. Sure. So how do we like start that whole entire thing going on?
Well, I think one of the things that agencies like ours do, and even in our somewhat weakened state, we've done that. We do lots of trainings for folks. We can come to your neighborhood, tell you exactly how the complaint process works, what you need to file a complaint. Sometimes you might not even need to file a complaint about something like that. You may just need to contact us, or again, have a relationship with the commanding officers in the area where you live or where you tend to operate most often, so you can take those concerns directly to them. So in that instance, you have a direct recourse either through the police department, through us. You can file complaints with your city council person, anyone there. So I would say two things. Understand how the complaint process works, understand your rights and responsibilities when you're stopped in some way, and also have a relationship with the officers who you're most likely to come in contact with.
And you can find the officers. The police department website is pretty good in terms of breaking down neighborhoods, and you can find who the appropriate officer is, so you can reach out and build that relationship like Kelly suggested. Yep. Please.
In regards to diversity throughout the police department, the DOJ report came out that police departments throughout the country are rife with white supremacists who has infiltrated through the departments. And with regards to diversity, it's been well known that in Philadelphia, they were saying a lot of minority officers were having a problem passing the psych exam. So how is it that white supremacists can pass the psych exam, but minority candidates can't? So first, who's issuing the exam? How are they grading it? And why the disparity? How can some just come through with ease and it's not picked up on through the psych exams, but minority candidates are being stopped at that level?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the reasons that Commissioner Ross has, and this is not going to answer your question directly, but I think that one of the reasons that Commissioner Ross has asked for a change in the way we and who we allow to become police officers at what age and what education level is to address the fact that we're not getting enough minority black male recruits, quite frankly. And some of that is exactly as you said, and I've heard this from both the Black Officers and the Latino Officers Association, that there's a problem with the psychological testing. Now, I don't know enough about it to speak to whether, it lets white racists in, but pushes out black. I don't know enough about the testing to really address that.
Are there numbers based on when they're in the academy that can tell us how many are rejected after going through these tests and screenings?
Yes.
I mean, because that goes back to the disqualifying factor this woman is talking about, because I know for a fact when I came through Air Force, the Air Force Academy trainings, all right, and we had certain things like that, because before they stuck me out in the hole in South Dakota, they had to know that, otherwise we'd have a whole bunch of Dr. Strangeloves. So I'm sure that, they've got to have something similar, and we should be able to see how many of these people are getting rejected, how many are black, how many are white.
But to lowering the standard, that would seem to create an even bigger imbalance. So you want people with more education, with more diversity, with more who are more culturally aware, who have a broader educational basis, as opposed to some guy whose his only reality is high school and his neighborhood. And now when you have so many recruits now coming from outside of the city who don't even understand the the different nuances of different neighborhoods and different people who they're going to be policing. Right. And you run across so many instances of I was afraid. Well, I mean, this isn't a job if you're afraid. Get a dog.
What's the relationship between this commission and internal affairs? How would you characterize that relationship?
I think it's pretty good. We've worked with a number of, well, internal affairs has seen quite a number of turnovers since I've been here, but I just was on the phone today with Deputy Commissioner Denise Turpin over a case that we're looking at. I've got several other cases I'm getting ready to put on her table. I think it's reasonably good. We try to work with them to solve problems when they come up. And the lieutenant in particular who's responsible for intake at the department does an exceptionally good job at doing that. We've been able to solve problems actually before the complaint investigation is finished in some instances. So I think that our relationship, we try to work complementary with them. For example, if someone won't give them an interview, then we'll send one of our folks out so we can get the job done. We want the questions answered, and I think Internal Affairs wants the questions answered too. Now, both of us have different sort of barriers to getting there, but sometimes when we work together, we can do quite well. We put our questions on the table at IA. We can sit there and we can ask a whole bunch of different questions, and that kind of ticks off the FOP occasionally, but that's how it should be. So what we believe, and this is primarily anecdotal because I can't tell you by actually having studied this, but it's my belief that when our folks are involved in an investigation, which isn't often enough, frankly, the result, I think, has more integrity than sometimes without, because we're going to ask somewhat different questions. It's going to push the IA investigator. We learn from them too. They've taught us quite a bit. So we use that to actually get to citizens' questions and get them answered properly.
Have there been any instances of police advisory committees across the country that are involved with the hiring process, the selection of police officers?
Excellent question. Yeah, that's something that actually one of my counterparts on the West Coast just asked, because she's in Washington State. And rarely, most police oversight agencies like ours are formed primarily initially to deal with complaints only.
So how
the
do we
negative
change
side
that?
of
Because
things.
obviously,
Yeah.
as we talk, like this, the root of the problem is the hiring process. So
No,
I think this needs to be a huge push.
No, you're absolutely right. I think
the
we
people
can.
hiring are the people that are part of the problem.
Yeah. Well, I don't see any barriers, at least in terms of how we're structured, from us trying to weigh in on that process. I can certainly.
Does the public get to review these exams? Is there an outside psychologist?
I think privacy would prevent you from publicly reviewing the exams of people who have been in the police office. But I think there is a way for us to impact the hiring process more generally. I don't know if it would break down to, as you said, actually allowing the public to specifically review individual cases as people or stuff as people go along, but there's certainly a way for us to be able to weigh in on the process. And and frankly, I've not really looked at that end of it because I'm so busy trying to deal with the shootings and the horrible stuff on this end. I don't have enough folks to really begin to dig, because that's a whole huge thing to be able to look at all the recruits, what they've done, look at all their records, et cetera. That's a
Even
whole
as much as like
section.
the red flags, and
Yeah.
there's a committee of the
Right.
public
Right.
that can go in
Right.
and look at those red flags that are being
Right.
pushed through the appeals process.
Right. Well, that's something we could probably, even now, I think where we are, we could probably, if we requested the right information and asked the right question, I think even in our current structure, we could do that. But it would be a matter of capacity, having the folks to do that.
And as we're looking at this time of, this commission being restructured with the other commission, I mean, this is time for citizen input, and what do you want to see in civilian oversight?
Exactly.
What are the things that you'd like us to do?
Yep.